The Bracero program brought guest Mexican workers into the United States through contracts. According to the agreement signed in 1942 by the United States and Mexican governments, the Bracero workers were guaranteed basic human rights, and it was the U.S. government's responsibility to see that they received these rights. Because of the heavy influence of United States agricultural officials, however, the United States government consciously ignored its responsibility to abide by the agreement established between the United States and Mexican governments and violated the basic human rights that were promised to the Mexican workers. To fully understand Roosevelt's motivation behind subsidizing the agricultural industry with Mexican workers, 4 important factors must be considered. First, agriculture played a much more direct role in the life of an average 1940s American than it does today. While roughly 3% of Americans live on farms today, almost 22% did at this time. This means that, in a democratic government, Roosevelt felt much more pressure from the people to see that the industry did not decline. A second factor that impacted this decision was the effect of World War II. As men and women of the United States were away fighting in the war, there were few people to do the agricultural labor. A lack of food and workers for the farms caused uproar, and Congress felt that it must intervene. Precedent also influenced the program's establishment. During World War I and the food shortage it brought, certain Mexican workers made contracts to work on the farms as long as their work was necessary. When the war came to a close, they were ushered out and American workers took their place. A previous Bracero-like program had been successful enough to give the government confidence. The events of the Great Depression, which the lawmakers of 1942 had witnessed, caused them to take great caution when considering how they would handle agricultural issues. They would do anything to keep the nation from poverty like that.
Well, in this country, that was a time of labor shortages. I think the war brought it on. And there had to be some agriculture work done, and there just wasn't any local people available.
In desperate need of workers for the farms, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt approached then-President of Mexico, Manuel Ávila Camacho, to discuss a possible labor agreement between the two countries. On July 23, 1942, the terms of the agreement were established, and Mexican laborers made their way into the United States. In 1951, these terms were formalized into Public Law 78, which lawmakers hoped would protect the rights of the Braceros. It held that laborers were entitled to fair treatment by their employer, transportation, and a full agreed-upon salary, among other specifications of the laws. The U.S. promised to these laborers that any discrimination against them would not be tolerated, that living and transportation expenses would be taken care of, and that substantial living conditions would be provided. By accepting the terms of the agreement, the United States became responsible for ensuring that every Bracero who entered the United States received the treatment they were promised. Just a year after the agreement was decided, the American Farm Bureau Administration recommended in H.R. 96 that the administration of this program be decentralized as far as possible, and that all workable hampering restrictions and controls, including the fixing of minimum wages, restrictions of hours, housing standards, and the unionization of workers, be immediately discontinued. The responsibilities that the American government still owed the Braceros to maintain were no longer formal. From this point on, fulfilling their responsibilities and protecting the Braceros was set aside as a new priority emerged: promoting adequate and highly efficient labor. In 1942, 4,211 Mexican workers were brought into the United States to work as agricultural laborers. Initially, entry to the United States for Braceros did not prove to be a great obstacle. Those who had their contracts settled entered, supervised by Mexican labor officials in Mexico City. However, as time passed and the demand for labor increased, men seeking work were forced through centros de contratación, or contracting centers, where they would be interviewed several times and undergo vigorous medical examination. Upon arrival, many Braceros immediately noticed flaws in the program. They were facing numerous difficulties, including inadequate wages, inhumane living conditions, mistreatment by employers, and blatant acts of racism, all which violated the contracts that they were working under.
There was not any real regulation over what was being done. I have seen paychecks of just cents. I mean, I'm talking about people who worked hours because there was no really any oversight.
Most braceros did not protest their harsh conditions. Some felt that the benefits exceeded the cost.
I think that the Bracero program was very positive. I mean, the most positive thing, of course, it was a legal way where you could have someone that was enthusiastic, wanted to work, and could work. And you also had them lined up with people that wanted their labor.
Some say that the mistreatment of the braceros is justified, as they had no other options. They had better conditions in the United States than in Mexico, regardless of whether or not the agreement was followed exactly. Their pay, while mediocre by American standards, was much higher than they could expect in Mexico. Simply because the Mexicans had no other option than to suffer through the harsh conditions does not mean that their rights were protected. The agreement was designed to be mutually beneficial. The American agricultural industry was being relieved of its economic instability, and it was their responsibility to ensure that the braceros' rights were upheld. By the early 1960s, the Bracero program had become a topic of public debate. The November 1960 CBS documentary, Harvest of Shame, convinced President John F. Kennedy that braceros were adversely affecting the wages, working conditions, and employment opportunities of our own agricultural workers. Despite effort by farmers to preserve the program, it eventually came to an end on December 31st, 1964. The Bracero program was controversial in its time. Mexican nationals, desperate for work, were willing to take physically demanding jobs at wages scorned by most Americans. The Bracero program was designed to protect the rights of Mexican workers. In practice, however, employers ignored many of these rules. Mexican and native workers suffered, while growers benefited from cheap, plentiful labor. American farm workers worried that braceros would compete for the jobs and lower wages. Mexican workers were treated poorly by American workers as they feared that the braceros were jeopardizing their own jobs. The U.S. government cannot be relieved of its responsibilities to abide by its original agreement to the braceros just because some endured their loss of rights in order to work in the United States. The history of the braceros has long been ignored by both Mexico and the United States. Once they were no longer needed in the United States, the Bracero workers had to return to their homeland without ever receiving, to this day, the payment that was withheld from their contracts, or recognition for their valuable contributions to the United States. Once the history is analyzed, then we can begin to recognize the efforts made by the Mexican farm laborers in the United States. If this recognition is achieved, then the old braceros and the future braceros will be dignified and maybe receive compensation for their efforts. Securing justice for the braceros, their children, and widows is necessary to reconcile the histories of the United States and Mexico.